The last of the really great Whangdoodles, uh, Part 1, Chapter 4. The house was marvelously interesting. To the left of a wide staircase stood a complete suit of armor. There were portraits on the walls, and it was easy for the children to guess that they were ancestors or relatives of their host, since the resemblance to him was unmistakable. There was a round table in the center of the hall, overflowing with books and magazines. The brass centerpiece was bursting with orange and red and yellow chrysanthemums. The man ushered the children into a small room. There were so many books that there didn't seem to be a space for anything else. Yet there was also a desk with a swivel chair behind it and a large globe of the world standing in the corner. Three complex and wonderful mobiles hung from the ceiling. The man motioned for them to sit down by the fire. "You'll have to sit on the carpet, I'm afraid," he said. "You see, I never have more than one particular armchair in here. It discourages company. Though, of course, I'm very pleased to see you this evening." He sat down in the chair. "Now, let me see if I remember your names. You're Melinda, and you're Benjamin, right?" Ben and Lindy nodded. "And oh dear," he paused to look at Tom. "Is it Teddy?" "Thomas, sir." "Thomas, of course. Silly of me. Although, allow me to introduce myself. I am Professor Samuel Savant." Ben gasped. "Golly! Are you the Professor Savant, the one who works at the university?" "I am." "Dad was telling us about you the other day," Tom said. "Was he indeed?" "Yes." "Where is your prize?" Lindy asked. "My prize?" "She means the Nobel Prize, sir." The professor chuckled. "I won't be receiving it for a while. But come on now. I am most interested to know how you found me." "We didn't know this was your house," said Tom. "We were out trick-or-treating," explained Ben. "Tom bet me 25 cents that I wouldn't knock on the doors," added Lindy. "I thought an awful witch lived here." "A witch? Mrs. Primrose, are you a witch?" the professor asked the sweet-looking woman that entered the room with a tray. "I sometimes think I would like to be one, sir," she said with a smile. Mrs. Primrose gave a steaming mug of hot chocolate to each child and placed a plate of cookies on the floor in front of them. The professor sipped his hot chocolate. That's good. So you thought a witch lived here, eh?" Ben felt embarrassed. "Everyone at school thinks this house is haunted." Their host suddenly became serious. "I'm afraid I'm responsible for that rumor. You see, I do hate to be bothered. I need a lot of place and a lot of peace and quiet when I'm working." "What do you really do?" asked Tom. "Well, I think a lot." "That's not much," said Lindy. "Oh, on the contrary, it's a great deal," replied the professor. "Right now I'm thinking about life. I ask myself questions about it, its origin and its meaning. Believe me, that takes a great deal of thought." He leaned forward on his chair. "Do you know that the secret of life has almost been captured? It's part of the alphabet now. Have you heard of DNA or RNA?" "I think so, sir," Ben said. But he looked puzzled and Tom shook his head. "DNA? That stands for dioribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid. I never had to say it before." "Good word, huh?" the professor grinned. "What does it mean?" Ben asked. "Well, let's see if I can explain it very simply." The professor touched the tips of his fingers together as he gave it some thought. "Try to imagine a human cell, a single microscopically small unit of life. Inside the nucleus, the very center is a sort of ladder, a ladder that twisted into a spiral. On that spiral is all the information as to how life comes about. That's a bit too complicated for me, said Tom. It is indeed complicated, answered the professor. Actually, it's miraculous. And DNA and RNA are the codes to life itself. I always thought that life had to do with God, said Lindy in a clear voice. Oh, my dear, the professor laughed and touched her head gently. I'm sure it does have a lot to do with God. Believe me, I think about him a great deal too. But however life began, and some scientists say it was by an incredible accident, and some say that it was by God's design, we do have the unique privilege of being on earth right now, and that's something you shouldn't take lightly. I like life very much, declared Lindy. She was a trifle confused about all this talk, though she was trying her best to understand it. There's only one thing I really hate, and that's P.E. P.E.? Physical education. Oh, I see. I am absolutely no good at it, complained Lindy, and I'm always being forced to do it. Tom spoke in a disgusted tone. Lindy, that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about. I know, she fibbed. I hope P.E. is the most serious problem you ever have to contend with, the professor said. He paused and then asked, what do you suppose is the most serious problem that grown-ups have? The children gave it some thought. Tom said, ecology. Daddy says it's too much starch in your shirts, said Lindy. I think it's the hydrogen bomb, said Ben after a moment. They're good answers. Ben is the closest, I think. But there is one thing more serious than that. More serious than the hydrogen bomb? Ben was surprised. Oh, yes, indeed. You see, in a very short time, the scientists who have discovered the secret of life will be able to make life. Then, in a way, we'll be playing God, as Lindy so aptly puts it. That's a huge responsibility. And we must hope that people won't be foolish. You know, the mind is a thing of extraordinary beauty. It has taken several million years for the human brain to know what we know today and to develop. Now, all we have to do is learn how to use it properly. Nobody in the room spoke for a while. The fire crackled noisily. The professor seemed lost in thought. Suddenly he came out of his reverie and addressed himself to Tom. Did you look up Whangdoodle in the dictionary as I suggested, young man? Tom smiled knowingly. I did. And it doesn't make any sense. Dad says a Whangdoodle probably doesn't exist. Of course it exists, the professor declared. I told you it did. Well, where is the Whangdoodle? Where does he live? Challenged Tom. Professor Savant looked at the children for a long moment as though he was trying to make up his mind about something. Then he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said quietly, the Whangdoodle lives in Whangdoodle Land, where he is king. He is the only animal left of his species, although there are other wonderful, fascinating creatures that live with him. There are gazooks and sidewinders, tree squeaks and swamp gaboons. There is an animal called the oink, and another called a proc. They have hardly ever been seen. In fact, they would do anything to avoid mankind. So far, they have been remarkably successful. The boys were enthralled. Lindy was so fascinated that she gazed at the professor with her mouth open as he continued. Hundreds of years ago, things were very different. Man believed in magic and miracles and folklore and legends. Myths and witchcraft and the spirits and such were all quite real because people believed in them. There were many Whangdoodles. They were found mostly in China and Greece, Africa, England, and the Scandinavian countries. Later, I believe, there were some Whangdoodles found in the islands of the Pacific. The professor opened his eyes and stretched his legs towards the fire. The popularity of the Whangdoodle was probably at its height in the Middle Ages, when people also believed in animals like unicorns and the wyvern and the great roc and the hippogriff. The Whangdoodle was said to be the wisest, the most generous, the most endearing of all creatures. As the years passed, man became involved in technology and agriculture and industry. Of course, it was natural for him to learn about his environment and the laws of nature, about the universe and how to get to the moon and so on. But as he broached this new part of his mind, so he closed the beautiful and fascinating part of the old, the area of fantasy. The more knowledge man gained, the more conscious he became about believing in fanciful creatures. People began to think that such things as dragons, goblins, and gremlins didn't exist. The terrible thing is that when man dismissed all the fanciful creatures from his mind, the Whangdoodle disappeared along with them. But where did the Whangdoodle go? Cried Lindy. By the time the Whangdoodles and the other animals realized what was happening to them, it was almost too late, said the professor. There was a tremendous upheaval. The dragons and the monsters became fearfully anxious, and they made a great fuss and fought with each other, and killed or destroyed themselves by the thousands, which was no help at all, of course. Many of the wonderful creatures from the past just faded away from sadness and neglect. There were only a few of them. That is why only a few of them remain today. And we're going to stop there and prepare for the next part of the chapter.